So actually, my comments run in very nicely with the conversation you just moderated. And as usual, you and your colleagues at Afore have done a great job with this workshop. I think a few takeaways from watching different parts of the conference is obviously this is a lot of complexity in drafting and implementing a regulatory framework for sustainable finance. And I think there is now a consensus among the major economies to try to allocate investor capital toward greener economic activities. As it has been said by many, and is well known, the EU has been engaging in this endeavor for many years and already has a suite of regulations aimed at achieving this goal. And it's only been recently that the United States has prioritized climate change and is starting to mobilize government resources to address the impact of climate risk on the US economy. This has been seen by President Biden directing the United States to rejoin the Paris Agreement and pledging that the United States would cut carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. The G7 has now made a commitment to limit the rise of global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius and to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, halving those emissions by 2030, which is less than 10 years from now. Now, Ingrid and others have noted that to finance this green revolution, there needs to be a massive amount of capital that will be needed from both public and private sectors. So this is neither only a public sector problem or a private sector problem. And speaking from the private sector side and the buy side, we do believe a significant amount of capital can be mobilized by investors who want to be part of this green revolution. And they want to capitalize on investment opportunities that materialize from scientific and technological innovation that will all be necessary to transition to this greener economy. While both the United States and the EU share the same goal of fostering a more sustainable economy, what I'd like to talk about is the fact that these governments are engaging in different strategies regarding how to facilitate this investment activity. And the divergence in the EU and US approaches to date does have some implications for investors. As we've already talked about in discussing the EU taxonomy, the EU strategy can be described in broad terms as a top-down approach, as European policymakers have taken an active role in directing capital flows to finance sustainable activities by determining ex ante which activities are green and then codifying these decisions in the taxonomy regulation. Now, this approach does have the advantage of providing assurance to investors and can enable investors to react more quickly as the EU policies help navigate them toward greener economic activities. The disadvantage of this approach is the fact that the regulatory framework, both the level 1 and the level 2 texts, need to be fairly prescriptive in describing the criteria the activity must meet, or what functions the activity should or should not perform to determine whether or not this activity can be defined as sustainable. And this approach depends on the government and the political process to make the correct determinations. The prescriptive nature of the framework limits its flexibility. And this lack of flexibility is a challenge when we need a taxonomy that can adapt to technological and scientific innovation. And if we take into account technological and scientific innovation, then clearly there's going to be a change in criteria over time, and the framework must be flexible. This framework will constantly need to be updated. And if it's not being updated in a timely manner, may actually produce uncertainty for investors. They'll need to wait for the regulatory regime to catch up to the advancements in innovation that will be necessary in order to meet global climate change goals. Additionally, significant delays will impede the ability of investors to fund emerging economic sustainable activities. This funding of these emerging activities are really going to be the engine that will drive the transition to a lower carbon economy. So to the extent that law and regulation actually becomes a hindrance to this funding is obviously not the intention, but could very well be the effect. Now, the EU's work on taxonomies provides an example of this top-down approach. As this conference has underscored, while the taxonomies will help the EU meet its environmental objectives, there are many challenges for investors in navigating the complexity of the taxonomy, especially the fact that the current taxonomy criteria is based on today's understanding of what is sustainable. And it's not easily adaptable to new considerations that will occur as part of the future economy. For example, the EU Taxonomy Climate Delegated Act, that's a mouthful, which classifies a subset of economic activities in the energy sector, such as solar, wind, tidal, hydro, and geothermal, as has been noted, does not include either natural gas or nuclear energy. And I think people at this conference know very well why that's the case. But as policy and industry stakeholders continue to debate whether or not there is room for these energy sources or a subset of them to be defined as sustainable, think about it from the perspective of the investor. There is little interest to allocate capital in potentially sustainable investments if there's not clarity from EU policymakers that it is acceptable under the taxonomy. So while we can debate the merits of natural gas or nuclear, that of course is a very important debate, and we need to be very respectful of the arguments on both sides. The fact is, to the extent that that question remains unanswered, there's going to be less capital driven to those sectors, which may actually have the effect of impeding the development of more sustainable activities in these energy sectors. And to the extent that natural gas and nuclear today, in today's economy, still play an important role, don't we need to make sure that capital continues to flow to those sectors, if anything, to enable them to transition to cleaner technologies? Now, in contrast to the EU, as I said in the last panel, the US has taken what can be loosely defined as a bottom-up approach, whereby investors are driving capital to fund sustainable companies' investments. And this approach has the advantage of allowing the markets, reflecting the consensus of individual investor preferences, to shape or at least have significant impact on which sustainable activities to promote. To enable investors to make informed decisions about the sustainability attributes of a company, US policymakers are focusing on providing investors with reliable, comparable, and consistent information about companies. And it's in this context that the US Securities and Exchange Commission recently requested public input on whether the SEC's existing climate change disclosures adequately inform investors about known financially material risks. And the SEC has received thousands of comment letters on this request. Now, we're expecting the SEC to publish a proposal on public company disclosure in October, as well as proposals on human capital management and corporate board diversity. And this kind of thinking about a new corporate disclosure requirement does represent a significant policy shift here in the United States. It's obviously very consistent with what President Biden has spoken about. And we at the Investment Company Institute strongly support this effort because we believe it will foster consistent, reliable, financially material information about companies. And the parameters of this should include disclosure of so-called Scope 1 and Scope 2 information about greenhouse gas emissions. And possibly a mechanism to consider whether or not to eventually include Scope 3. The mechanism would reflect the fact that it is difficult today, data is not available to disclose information about Scope 3, but there should be an effort to try to at least investigate and consider whether or not maybe some point in the future it is possible, assuming metrics, data, methodologies can be agreed upon. Now, we like to talk about here in the United States about the importance of a principle-based approach. And here's an example of where a principle-based approach toward disclosure may actually work very well. A framework that is flexible allows the organic development of disclosure of data best suited for investment decisions. And this flexibility will help take into account developments as they occur over time. Now, we do not expect the SEC to stop only with public company disclosure. As I said before, we expect in 2022, it will also do disclosure requirements for investment advisors and investment companies. And this, of course, will also track what the EU has done. And I should note that we advocate, but also I think SEC officials admit that they need to study what has been done already in the EU in order to consider what the United States should do. And I think for many of you who are familiar with past US regulatory developments, this is a welcome step because hopefully the SEC approach will try to match as closely as possible the EU approach to avoid regulatory conflict. They will not be identical. They will probably be different, but at least some of the cross-border challenges can be mitigated. And this would be a very positive development for a global economy. So what does this all mean? Let me just make one final comment as my conclusion. No single jurisdiction has the capacity to transition the global economy to a greener future on its own, right? This has got to be a global effort. And to this end, policymakers should strive to establish sustainable finance policies that can align across jurisdictions. And through these policies, encourage economic actors to change their behavior to support more sustainable investments. This is a tall challenge, given the number of sustainable finance regulation, frameworks, standards that have been drafted, adopted, or implemented all over the world, or in international standard setting bodies, or in private stakeholder groups. However, from the perspective of the investment community, the objective is achievable. Taking a bottoms-up approach to sustainable finance regulation, whereby investor behavior drives domestic policy consideration, has the inherent ability to create policy alignment across frameworks. And this is because investors who are focused on ESG investing are generally seeking specific objectives. They're either to create better performance returns or to put their money where their values are, or some combination of the two. And because there is, in broad terms, a certain degree of behavioral predictability in how these investors act, sustainable finance policies that have been influenced by investor behavior will tend to be underpinned by similar norms. And it is the similarity of norms that can help align policies across jurisdictions. This alignment does not mean policies need to be identical, but it does mean that the policies can work together in tandem and without conflict. Embracing the bottoms-up approach, where practicable, may be a useful strategy in enhancing efficiencies between jurisdictions to support greater allocation of investor capital to fund the transition to a greater carbon neutral economy. And that is the thought that I'll leave with you today. Thank you, Nick, for giving me the opportunity to speak to everybody.
Thank you, because I knew it would be a perfect way of closing this conference and made my life much easier. Because all I now need to do, because I thought this was very, very interesting, I think the only thing I need to do is first thank the panelists and thank you for your time this afternoon and the really good discussion. I think to flag to the audience that we will continue our own discussion series in the autumn, and I know Eric needs to go off in the autumn, and we will look again at disclosure in more detail, but Tomo, we will also look at risk management and stress testing, coming back to Pillar 3 specifically. I think we'll have a session on that. And Ingrid, I will, at some stage when things settle down, come back to you and we can look a bit more at the EU-UK relationship and how that evolves on this. I think with this, I just would like to do one very last thing, which is to thank the audience for being with us. and asking a lot of questions over the days, all the panelists, and just also would like to thank the members of my team, and particularly Emmanuel and Ilona, Marilise, and Daniel, Jonathan, and Martina, and importantly, Chris and Alu. And with that, thank you to all of you, and watch the space. We will make these discussions available to watch again for those who could only watch parts of it. But thank you very much to all of you for the time being, and have a lovely evening. Thank you very much indeed.